Welcome to Mississippi History from a Christian Perspective. I'm your host, Tracy Robinson. Slavery was widely practiced throughout the Mississippi Territory. Even though the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808, this did not free many that were already enslaved. Slaves faced a difficult life. They often had no one but the Lord for help. Many slaves became Christians and learned to look to God for strength. Faced with the rigors of a life of enslavement, they developed hearts that overflowed with music and that expressed their faith in Jesus Christ. Many of these Christian slaves learned to blend their voices in spiritual songs called Negro spirituals. These spirituals combined their African heritage and newfound faith in powerful and moving ways. There were those people who fought against slavery individually. These people were known as abolitionists. There were some abolitionist pastors who recommended that slaves follow the biblical injunction for obedience. Some slaves recognized that even if they could not be free physically, their faith in Christ did give them spiritual freedom. Baptist churches in Mississippi became embroiled in controversy when they attempted to help slaves establish their own churches early in the 1800s. The state legislature enacted a law prohibiting blacks from assembling. This law arose from the fear that the slave uprisings would take place and effectively killed the growth of black churches in the antebellum years. Black church members were, however, invited to join many white churches during this time. Churches within Mississippi appealed to the state legislature to repeal the anti-assembly law as it related to black churches. The legislature refused to repeal the law, and the organized black churches ceased to exist until after the Civil War. Liberia was a West African nation that had been founded by the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society was an abolitionist group which believed black people would face better chances on African soil. While some truly believed they were undoing a wrong by returning the people to their homeland, there were many Northerners who helped because while they did not like slavery for moral reasons or for the sake of business competition against slave labor, they also did not want freed black slaves in the North and therefore participated in deporting them. The state of Mississippi underwent rapid changes in the 1800s. In the 1830s, Mississippi was still largely an open frontier. After the Indian Removal Acts, there were literally millions of acres of land open to the settlers. The attitudes of Mississippians were gradually changing too. A great divide was forming between the northern and southern states over the issues nullification and slavery. Nullification is an action taken by a state to declare a federal law unconstitutional and to prevent the law's enforcement within the state boundaries. Mississippians believed nullification to be wrong at the beginning of the 1800s, but by the middle of the century, they were embracing the notion. Nullification became an issue as a reaction to a federal tariff law. The United States Congress adopted a protective tariff which taxed imported goods so American manufacturers could compete with cheaply produced foreign goods. When Congress adopted the first tariff in 1816, the southern states agreed. However, when a new higher tariff was introduced in 1824, loud protests came from the New England shippers down to the southern states. Mississippi, along with the rest of the southern states, had an economy based on the export of cotton and therefore stood firmly against protective tariffs. Southern states began to talk of nullification. For the first time, southern states began to talk of seceding as well. At the early part of the 1800s, slavery was regarded as a necessary evil. However, as slaveholders and wealth increased, the attitude towards slavery underwent a change. Eventually, the institution began to be regarded as a positive good. In many ways, slavery held back Mississippi economically. Because the state's focus was mainly agricultural, it fell behind northern states in industrialization. The lack of technology put Mississippi at the mercy of northern manufacturers who could demand high prices for goods that once had been available at lower cost through foreign trade before the tariffs. Slave labor also discouraged skilled tradesmen from seeking jobs in the South. In a society dominated by slavery, reasonably paying jobs were difficult to find. With the lack of skilled workers to encourage industrial development, Southern states fell behind their Northern counterparts. It was not until the 1850s, when disputes over the extension of slavery into the new territories further west were being heatedly discussed in the U.S. Congress, that the idea of secession began to gain popularity. As long as the number of slave states and free states remained in balance, the Southern states felt secure their lifestyle would be protected. Mississippians believed if free states ever outnumbered the slave states, it would lead the legislation to abolish slavery. In 1849 and 1850, Congress was trying to solve the problem of slavery in California, as well as new territories ceded by Mexico. Henry Clay devised the Compromise of 1850 to meet the needs of the North and the South. California was admitted as a free state, but any runaway slaves in any state would be returned to their owners. When the U.S. began contemplating the addition of the Nebraska Territory, consideration was given to split the territory into two states, Nebraska and Kansas. Most leaders felt that Nebraska would choose to become a free state and that Kansas would choose to become a slave state, thereby keeping the balance. Nebraska did indeed choose to become a free state. Radicals from each side of the slavery anti-slavery debate, however, immediately crossed state lines into Kansas. These radicals began to exercise strong influence on the citizens in Kansas. Many remained in Kansas to vote on the issue, hoping to swing the vote to their side by their illegal ballots. Both sides were determined to have their way in this political and social issue. The conflict regretfully led to bloodshed when men used evil means to push their views. Federal troops had to be sent to restore the peace. Several things happened over the next 10 years that destroyed the influence of the more conservative Unionist Party within Mississippi. The Kansas struggle was one major factor. It caused the opinion of the Southern states to swing against abolitionists. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin turned popular opinion in the North sharply against the slaveholders and was sorely resented by people in the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 further intensified the feelings of resentment on the part of Southern states against the North. By this time, the state of Mississippi was almost totally led by Democrat secessionist senators. Other elected officials, as well as the governor, held secessionist feelings. Although the Republican Party pledged to restrict the advancement of slavery, Mississippians felt that the total abolishment of slavery was near. Finally, emotions won out over logic, rationality, and godliness. Mississippians felt that secession would preserve slavery and their way of life. In turn, Mississippians chose a path of secession, thus following their southern neighboring states. With the election of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States in 1860, events affecting national unity began to develop rapidly. The South Carolina legislature immediately voted to secede from the Union. Other states quickly followed. Mississippi seceded on January the 9th of 1861. The first move of the newly organized Confederacy was to take over several federal properties within the state line, such as forts, post offices, and the New Orleans Mint. The Confederacy also began to raise an army and tried to open diplomatic relations with foreign nations. President Lincoln pled for national unity. He tried to assure Southern states that their rights would be protected if they remained in the Union. The Southern states, however, refused to recognize President Lincoln's appeals. Lincoln was forced to make a decision about how to deal with the seceding states. The president took a strong stand and promised to enforce federal law in all states. Mr. Lincoln felt that the Constitution of the United States was a permanent binding contract and that secession was illegal. Southerners, on the other hand, believed the Constitution to be a compact, not a contract. They believed they had entered the compact voluntarily and could therefore leave the Union voluntarily at any time. The war between the states began on April the 12th of 1861, when Confederate shore batteries opened fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. After 2 days of shelling, the fort had to be surrendered because of lack of provisions. In our next lesson, we'll discuss events that occurred in and around Mississippi during the Civil War.